Good morning to you and welcome to Penn Vicarage on this beautiful sunny Friday morning. Great to see you. Hope you're cheerful and well, and thank you for joining us for our Bible reflection today, our journey through the remarkable book of the prophet Isaiah. And friends, we are in chapter 27 here, so here we go. On that day, the Lord with his cruel and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will kill the dragon that's in the sea. On that day, a pleasant vineyard sing about it. I, the Lord, am its keeper. Every moment I water it. I guard it night and day, so that no one can harm it. I have no wrath. If it gives me thorns and briars, I will march into battle against it. I will burn it up, or else let it cling to me for protection. Let it make peace with me. Let it make peace with me. In days to come, Jacob shall take its root. Israel it shall blossom and put forth shoots, and fill the whole world with fruit. He struck them down as he struck down those who struck them. Or have they been killed as their killers were killed? By expulsion, by exile, you struggled against them. With his fierce blast he removed them in the day of the east wind. Therefore by this the guilt of Jacob will be expiated, and this will be the full fruit of the removal of his sin, when he makes all the stones of the altars like chalk stones crushed to pieces. No sacred poles or incense altars will remain standing. For the fortified city is solitary, a habitation deserted and forsaken like the wilderness. The calves graze there. There they lie down and strip its branches. When its boughs are dry, they are broken. Women come and make a fire of them. For this is the people without understanding. Therefore he that made them will not have compassion on them. He that formed them will show them no favour. On that day the Lord will thrash from the channel of the Euphrates to the Wadi of Egypt, and you will be gathered one by one, O people of Israel. And on that day a great trumpet will be blown, and those who were lost in the land of Assyria and those who were driven out to the land of Egypt will come and worship the Lord on the holy mountain at Jerusalem. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, essentially this chapter is in 4 sections. There is verse 1, there is verses 2 to 6, there is 7 to 11, and 12 and 13. It's kind of quite obvious. It cuts itself quite neatly into 4 sections. I will take them one at a time. Firstly, verse 1, all this is about Leviathan. Now, Leviathan is an interesting character. You see Leviathan mentioned in the book of Job. I forget where about, around about chapter 26, 27, there or thereabouts, I think. Check it, Google it, check it at your leisure. Leviathan, essentially, is often portrayed in sort of children's storybooks as like a great big serpent, or even a crocodile sometimes. Leviathan really is kind of what you might call a metaphysical chaos monster. And the idea is this great big beast sort of swimming around in the sea somewhere. And the sea was always code for chaos. And Leviathan was always code for sort of the monster of the chaos, that kind of thing. Which is why Jesus' disciples find it so remarkable when Jesus is on the boat and he stills the storm. Because stormy weather on the sea, you know, the fact that Jesus has power over the sea is kind of considered to be a thing that only God can do. So here you have God showing on that day, it says, the Lord will crush Leviathan, meaning God will get order out of chaos. Where there has been chaos and disharmony and so on now, God will bring order to that. And it's saying here in verse 1 that on that day, a great day when God's work is complete, if you like, God will crush the chaos monster, that order will reign, that the storm will be stilled, that he will bring order out of chaos, and the world will be good. So that's what Leviathan's about, like a chaos monster. And it's saying that on that day, the Lord will have power over that and will crush Leviathan. Then verses 2 to 6, for this, it's about a vineyard. And essentially with this, what you need to do is compare it, or as they used to say at school, compare and contrast, with Isaiah chapter 5, when he talks, so check it out a few chapters ago, Isaiah chapter 5, he talks about the parable of the vineyard, which of course Jesus refers to as well, and slightly reworks in Mark and chapter 12. He's also in Matthew or Luke, but Mark chapter 12 if you want to look at it. And what you've got here, you have to contrast Isaiah's talk about the parable of the vineyard in chapter 5 with what you've got here. And there's a big change, because Isaiah 5 is about what it was like before God's purification and after, and chapter 27 is what it's like after. So in chapter 5, You have a vineyard which meant well but produced no fruit. Here in chapter 27, after purification, it provides fruit. In chapter 5, it got no rain. Here in chapter 27, it gets lots of rain. In chapter 5, because it goes wrong, it gets abandoned. In this, it gets guarded, and it's guarded beautifully. Actually, it says if the chapter 3 and 4, verses 3 and 4, almost imply, come on, make my day. Almost God almost says here, please do come and attack it, because I'd love to have the honor to defend it. So in chapter 5, before the purification, the vineyard was abandoned. Here now, the vineyard is guarded and guided by God. In chapter 5, the vineyard becomes overwhelmed with thorns and briars. In chapter 27, there are none. In chapter 5, it is overrun. In chapter 27, it actually goes the other way around, and it actually spreads out from the vineyard. And as I say, in chapter 5, you had it being overrun. In chapter 27, it is guarded by God. So notice the contrast between what it was like before God purifies them, and that chapter 27 is after. So compare chapter 5 with chapter 27, and you kind of see the difference. So what it's saying is, in chapter 5, you had God's disappointment with what his people, how good they had meant to be, but how badly they turned out. He now, in what he talks about, all this judgment and so on in Isaiah, it's all about purifying them. So that in chapter 27, you see the difference. It's much better now. It's fruitful, it's guarded, it's excellent, it spreads abroad, and so on. So notice the change. It was bad. God purifies. Now it's good. Contrast chapter 5, the vineyard, with chapter 27's vineyard, and you see what God has done. So that's what's going on in verses 2 to 6. Then in verses 7 to 11, again, you sort of see really here what God is doing. That's, God's, bring back to present realities. Verses 2 to 6 have shown us how good things are going to be. But for now, what we have is judgment. And what God is doing, he's purifying his people. But what, again, is quite interesting here is, and he's saying this to people for whom this judgment is going to be hard. And no one likes to be judged, because no one likes to be told you've got it wrong, do they? But in verse 7, what you see is, it's less, God's judgment on his people is less severe than those around. So has he struck them down as he struck down those who struck them? Or have they been killed as their killers were killed? So what he's saying is, yes, God's people, you are going to be judged, but less severely than were judged by the people around you. Then in verse 8, notice it's done much more by measure. It says here, verse 8, by expulsion, by exile, you struggled against them. Apparently, by expulsion is not a great translation. Measure by measure is what the Revised Standard Version has it as, which makes it very different. Measure by measure, you struggled against them. So it very much gives the impression that it's more control. So God's judgment on his people is not it's not a scattergun, it's not a blunderbuss, it's not carpet bombing. What you got here is it's done measure by measure. It's done carefully in a controlled way. So God judges his people, but it's done in a measured way. And also in verse 9, the end of it all, the purpose of it all, that it does have an aim, it has an intention, and the intention is one of atonement, expiation, of getting right with God again. Therefore, by this, the guilt of Jacob will be expiated. By this will the fruit the removal of his sin. So the aim of it all is not judgment for fun. It's not judgment for judgment's sake. The aim of it is that God's people will be put right. The aim of it is atonement, that they'll become right with God again. So what he's saying is, as I said in the first few verses, after the bit about Leviathan, then there's the contrast with the vineyards, as it was before, as it will be in the future. But for now, we're going through judgment. And yes, this judgment is painful. No one likes to be told they've got it wrong. But what he's saying here is it's less severe than the nations around, that it's controlled, it's not scattergun, and there is an intention behind it all. And the aim is to be right with God. That's kind of what it's all about. But he finishes again on verses 12 and 13 with a couple of pictures here, a couple of images, which are lovely, which we can kind of think about. And one is agricultural. He talks about threshing one day, threshing from the channel of the Euphrates to the Wadi of Egypt, and gathered one by one. So apparently the words here are used with great tenderness. That one day will be a day when, like an agriculturalist or a farmer gathers in, threshes and gathers in the harvest, one day, beautiful picture here, will gather his people in again as well. But the other image at the end is that of worship, that the people will come and worship the Lord on the holy mountain at Jerusalem. That one day a day will come when people will gather together for worship, rather than being scattered as they have been scattered by the Assyrians and the Egyptians and everybody else, that they'll be gathered together again, and that the people of God will gather. And there is something very special about people, God's people being gathered. And people say things like, well, what's the church for? And sometimes the way the church acts, sometimes I have some sympathy with that. But God's people being gathered together. I was in the cathedral the other night. There were about 200 people, or 300 people there. And hearing everybody singing was fantastic. People being gathered together from across this sort of local area. It was actually a gathering of church wardens, believe it or not. But having everyone gathered together was fantastic. And it was really, really powerful. Hearing everyone singing and everyone gathered was a great thing to do. And this lovely picture here, firstly, of God gathering his harvest, but also the gathering together to worship together on the holy mountain at Jerusalem, gathered together to worship God. So you've got God's, in this chapter, you've got God's crushing the chaos monster Leviathan. You've got the contrast between verses 2 to 6, between the vineyard in chapter 5 and the vineyard here, that God's sorting it out and it was unfruitful, but now it's fruitful, and so on. Then you've got God's judgment for now, but notice that it's less severe, and it's painful, but it's less severe than other nations, that it's controlled, and that it does have a purpose, and the purpose is atonement. But that one day, on that day, God will gather together his people like agriculturists, like a farmer gathers the harvest, and they'll gather together to worship on God's holy mountain. And that's a pretty good picture to me. Have a lovely weekend, my friends. Do please share this message with your friends. Do put a share button at the bottom. If you're around, I would love to see you at church this weekend. If you're free, you'd be with some great services, and you'd be very, very welcome. God bless you. Enjoy the sunshine, and have a lovely